Hello, Jan Recker and Youngjin Yoo.
Hey, Nick.
Hey, Nick. Hey, Youngjin. Good to have you.
Yeah, well, welcome, Youngjin, to our podcast. We invited you to join us because, Jan and I have talked about theory. And Jan has this idea that we don't need theory. That we've talked about in previous podcasts, right? He's kind of one of these empiricists that thinks we overdo theory. And I, of course, like theory, but I can understand a variety of perspectives. And then we were thinking, well, wait a second, what do we mean by theory? And how do you generate theory anyway? So we were looking around at who we know, and we're thinking, who is it's like the energizer bunny of idea generation. And we thought, Youngjin Yoo, you're like the energizer bunny of idea generation and theory generation. And so we figured we'd get you on board and discuss theory. So that's your job. Does that sound good?
We'll see how it goes.
So let's start off. Yeah. Let's start off with a question. And I have this question for both of you. What is theory?
Oh, geez, you always start with the lamest of questions. Like
Is that a lame question?
Yeah, of course it's a lame question. We don't want to talk about theory. We want to talk about theorizing.
Yeah, but before you talk about theorizing, you need to know what theory is. Like, what's the goal that you're trying to reach?
Okay. You know what? I'll shut up.
Is this bad?
You handle this, Youngjin. You handle this.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think the theory is for there are so many different ways to use the word theory, right? Like you could use it as a layman. I have a theory. When you have a cocktail party, and then you can have a theory on everything, right? But that's not what we are talking about as a scholar. To me, I think a theory is basic sort of a way of thinking about some form of regulations of the world, some form of order by which you could understand and then predict the world in which we live.
Right, stop right there. You made two big statements. One is it's not what you do at a cocktail party, right? Which is you have a theory about, and then you went ahead and proceeded with defining what we do at a cocktail party, which is it's our way of,
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, there is no differences between the two. But I think the difference here is that, when you do a theorizing a cocktail party, you don't need any basis. You just need to have a very, loud voice, and just pursue it. But when you do this in a scientific discourse, you better have some evidence, you better have some logic, and you are engaging in a dialogue. So in a way, I don't see that is any different in the sense that we are engaging in a dialogue. In a cocktail party, you just do it, in person and immediate response. And, someone says that it's bullshit or, I agree with you. Whereas in academia or scholarly community, we do it through writing. We conduct research in order to provide and generate evidence. And then we write about it, and then we go to conference to vet the idea, and then we go to the journal. But at the end, I think you have a audience that you want to convince. So in that sense, I don't think there is no difference between what we do at a cocktail party and through academic writing.
Yeah, can I jump in there? Because I would have said when it said my standard go-to answer is theory is a proposed explanation for something that happens in the world. We see something, want to explain what's going on. And you called it the sort of, what did you call it? The regularities, right? So I want to identify which patterns, which mechanisms are at work here that, lead to this thing that I can see. So that's an explanation, right? So I like that normally. Now, then you came up with this dinner party example. And I think it is on some level, it's the same thing. I can theorize it at a dinner party, but I think what we do there, the nuance there is more tilted towards prediction, right? I'm just offering a bold prediction. Why, I don't know why Nick is dressed up the way it is. So it doesn't have to be something in the future, but I'm just giving you a guess, a prediction about, hey, I guess that, he dressed this way because he forgot to wash his jeans. That's a theory. It's a stupid one.
Listen, this is a podcast. What I'm wearing has no bearing whatsoever on our discussion.
You would like to think so, but no. And so there we have more, I guess the emphasis there is more on prediction, whereas in most of the science stuff, it's more on this explanation, on making sense and explaining, what's going on. But of course, this can carry over, right? I can I can explain something at a dinner party. I can offer a theory to explain some topic that is being discussed, in the same sense that I guess I can use theory in a scientific article to make a prediction about something that is yet to occur, right?
So I'll give you yet a third definition of what a theory is. Like, you're talking about explaining and predicting, and like a good German, you're going to now come up with an organized classification scheme of different types of theories. There are explanatory theories, there are predictive theories, there's this. What I'm going to say is this: the American pragmatist view of theory, John Dewey, right, William James, is it's simply a statement of belief, right? And John Dewey in particular was kind of aggressive about this. He thought theory, he had kind of a common sense view of theory, which is your theory at the cocktail party, kind of right where Youngjin started us. Your theory at the cocktail party and your theory in scientific discourse are not, there's no difference in kind between the two. It's a difference in degree, right? One is more, and at the cocktail party, you can actually have a very well thought out, well-founded, well-researched belief that you're stating, or it could be just pulled out of the air, right? Similarly, scientists, some of the greatest scientific findings were kind of unjustified, without evidence, right? Beliefs that ended up, impacting the world fairly dramatically. So I think that idea of statement of belief, to me, leads us to a humble view of theory. It's not, we don't have reserved knowledge as scientists, privileged knowledge. We're just fools moving along in the wilderness. We happen to have a good set of skills so we can find evidence for some of our beliefs. Our beliefs will hold, but that's all they are, is beliefs, and they could be wrong.
Well, I think it's, I know we want to talk about theory, but, the notion of theory comes from, the scientific discourse. But when you think about science, when it began, it was this absolute power that, whose source of power was drawn from, divine power from God or religious text or the government. And the science says that no, we draw our authority from evidence, from our, discourse in our logic,
Francis Bacon.
So,
yeah.
Right, exactly. So in that sense, I think that we need to be careful about saying that all theories are the same. And then I think we are getting into this really dangerous area where anything goes. Now, of course, you can do all kinds of silly theorizing even in science, but chances are those silly ideas may not be, I'm saying silly, in a sense that, the one that will never be proven, can be validated. They will be filtered out. Now, of course, that could be turn out to be wrong, because decades later, what started as a completely silly joke ended up being a very serious, explanation of how the universe works, right? So, but I generally think that we have to, not that we want to elevate science in a different playing field, because it's just one form of discourse we have in the society. There is a historical discourse, there's a legal discourse, there is a journalistic discourse, and scientific discourse is one form. It has its own place in our society, and I think we need to respect that. We need to preserve it, and we don't necessarily want to degrade it too much. I like the way that you
like being an elite. You like being an elite and having an unassailable place in the ivory tower. You don't want to be down with regular people.
No, I think that's
I like. I think the society has some form of, the elite means different things to different people. But here, I think, whether it is elite or not, there are different kinds of elites.
Yeah.
There's a media elite, there's an entertainment elite, there's a sort of scientific elite. We all have a different role to play. There's a religious elite, the elite. There's a political elite. There's a physical elite. There are people who are more powerful than I am. I think we all bring different perspectives. In this sense, I like to take a very humble view of what science is, because it is just one of many different. So, and I think there is a dangerous trend among scientists that, scientific absolutism, because it's as if the science is the only way to think about the world. And then I think that is equally wrong. And then science now has become its own authority in the way that as religion used to be. And I think that is also equally dangerous. So in that sense, I'd like to have a humble attitude, but that doesn't mean that everything is the same.
And I think this is all very evident at the moment. Like if you look at what's going on in the society around this planet in the context of the pandemic, we see this, right? We see that we have these different discourses, and all of a sudden their status has been shifted a little bit, and that doesn't come without friction, right? So, for example, in Europe, over the last 1.5 years, the discourse of the scientists has elevated to much greater emphasis, carrying over into the political discourse, and also being at least in friction with, for example, the journalistic discourse. And that's not to say in an elite sense that it's better in any sort, but rather that it also shows a lot of the limits, right? So, for example, some of the key scientists in Germany that have been doing the science around COVID, but also now had to do some public engagement. They sort of advise policy, etc., and they realize, how bad they are at this, and how some scientific evidence doesn't necessarily translate to political actions, and right. That there are different processes at work, and they're frustrated. And some of them are sort of turned away from this and went back into their little scientific discourse corner and shut the door, so to speak. Other have tried to stay and moved over into these other discourses and so forth, right? So I think that goes with what Youngjin was saying. They're different discourses, and they carry different orders, I guess, on the planet. I mean, another example would be, in history, people have tried to build meritocracies, right? So sort of having basically the political discourse by some sort of elite group of scientists, and all of these attempts failed. So it's not a good idea to have scientists rule the country because they're really bad at the political discourse, right? Yeah. So that goes to say that there might be an elite, but not in a hierarchical sense that one group or one discourse is more valuable than another one. It's just, I think what you meant to say is there are different discourses, and they have certain roles to play. And as we now see, sometimes they shift, and that can be, well, at least a complex thing, right?
Yeah.
So I want to, this is why I sort of jabbed at Nick in the beginning, because I actually wanted to talk about something that's connected, of course, but slightly different, right? So I wanted to talk about theorizing with an emphasis on the ing rather than theory, right? So
how to do theory.
Exactly. And I have a little story to tell that sort of sets this up. So Youngjin, you know the story. So it actually happens that Youngjin and I and others, we've been working on a theory-only paper. So there's no data. Right. And a couple of weeks ago, I was.
Which, by the way, no one should do ever, because they're the worst. They're the hardest papers to publish. This is the problem. This is my theory on theory papers. And I'll let you continue in a minute. I think people see the ones that get published, right? They see the work like, Youngjin's paper on experiential computing, and they think, hey, that's a good paper. That's an interesting idea. I can do that. And what they don't realize is that there were 850 papers that were probably more or less equally good ideas, and maybe not equally good ideas, but fine ideas, that through whatever circumstances, it gets rejected in the process. And the vast majority of theory papers get rejected because they're really easy to kill when you don't have data. And they only see the ones that somehow survived the process, which aren't necessarily the best papers. Some are wonderful, some are mediocre. They're not the best papers. But people will write these conceptual papers, they'll submit them to top journals, they'll just get rejected all the time, and no one sees the ones that are rejected.
Well,
right?
Number one.
So you don't write theory papers because they're impossible to publish, and they're
number one, that is the very reason we want to talk about this. So we can talk about some of the things that one might do that lead to these things working or not working out. Number two, I don't buy this argument at all. First of all the empirical papers get rejected all the time. Try writing a new method paper. That's equally hard. Number three, just because you're saying it's hard, therefore we should do it. That's not a good argument for anything, because then
I was thinking for junior faculty who listen to our podcast, right? I think it's way easier for a junior faculty or a junior person who knows their method really well, gets a good data set to get a paper. Now they'll probably still get rejected, but it's way harder for a junior person to get a conceptual paper through anyway.
There might be something to it. But so I worked when I was still in Australia. I had I guess you would call it an endowed chair, sort of like a chair that came with sort of some financial support, but also with obligations to work closely with the company. So for a couple of years, I was really deep into engaged research, collaborative research with these guys. When that was finished, I actually literally sat down and said, like, oh, for a while, I don't want to do empirics anymore. Like, I'm going to start working on some theoretical papers now, just to get a little bit of contrast. Yes, I had the privilege of doing so. I was tenured and so forth, right? So no, it's not quite the same as the young assistant prof, etc. But sort of for me, I think that was important just to get out of the weeds of that difficult situation and throw myself into the weeds of a different difficult situation. But that's not what I wanted to talk about here. So I'm working on this paper with Youngjin, theory only, and I was asked to present it at a seminar, which is good because we got reviews back and we're revising the paper and we're workshopping it, which is a really good idea for anyone to do. So I'm presenting on this paper and there's a bunch of people listening to it, and then have questions in the end. And the very first question completely threw me overboard. So this lady in the audience says, "Thank you, Jan, for this insightful presentation. Can you talk a little bit more about how you guys came up with the theory that I just presented? What did you do?" And I responded this way. What do you mean? We met for 2 years and talked, and at some stage we wrote this stuff down. So that was my explanation of our theorizing process. And then I
pretty impressive.
Yeah, I mean, like, what do you say to this question? What did we do? I don't know. We just gathered every Wednesday and talked, and at some stage we wrote it down, right? I mean, obviously there's got to be more to it, right? But what exactly did we do? What did we do? What do you do? We talked, and then we started typing. So that's what I want to talk about, right?
Did you actually type while talking, like on Wednesdays? How did you capture what you were? Like, it was the two of you with another colleague, right? This is the project you're talking about. And what did you do on those Wednesdays that you met?
We talk, and the other colleague, I think he's typing sometimes, but we take some notes, and then.
Did you have a joint document?
We have a Word, and then the other colleague is an incredible writer. So he in the first version of the paper that we started writing with Jan, it was after ISIS in Shanghai, right? It's something like that, and our co-author between our meeting and by the time that I returned to the US. He produced like 3 complete different versions of the manuscript because, and I didn't even get a chance to read them because I was still at a conference. He returned home early, and he was not happy with each version, so he kept rewriting the whole paper throughout that. I don't know, maybe 5 days. So I think we are fortunate to have. A co-author who's an incredible writer, fast and careful, beautiful writer. And that I think is also help. And Jan and I'm just.
And he was documenting the conversation basically in writing fairly quickly, fairly early. Right?
Not in that sense that you make it out to be. It's not like anyone was reading there typing up notes. And very often we would go on for months. Certainly weeks. I don't know whether that was months, but it was weeks and weeks and weeks of just talking until I think the process is we talked things through until we all had the same picture on our head. And then we started to verbalize and sort of, put it down on paper. And yes, in this particular case, most of the writing is done by one guy, probably because he's the best writer of all of us. But also, it's better to do it this way, to have one voice, sort of, have one way of telling the same story. Because I write very differently from Youngjin or from you, and so it would just be a horrible mix-up in the rhetoric when we still try to get one idea across, right? But I think we figured out what the idea is first before. I don't know. It's hard to say, right?
So I was cleaning my hard disk the other day, and then I found a folder that I didn't recognize, and there was a folder that started in like 2016 or something like that with the other co-author. At that time, Jan wasn't even involved. So, and I know that, he was working with Jan on a separate sort of project for a long time. that project that I had with him never got published. We had some workshop papers, but that one began by us, sitting down at number of different conferences. We've been having a conversation about this, and I said we should actually sit down and then write about it, and then we've been carrying on that conversation, and that one also got mixed with other project that I've been working on and thought that I've been having. So this particular idea, that the main theoretical idea that is now driving this paper, it was really interesting. So our co-author said, like in the middle of night, like 1 a.m., he sent an email saying, almost apologetic email, saying that, hey guys, I have this crazy idea. I think it may work. And then he explained his idea. And then when I read it, I said, oh my God, I've been thinking about exactly the same idea for a long, long time. Our entry points were completely different. He was coming from sociological perspective, and I was coming from biological perspective.
So Youngjin, this is what I'm hearing. Now you guys are talking about talking a lot and doing all this. I don't buy that you had the ideas you think you had. I don't buy any. I think that what happens is ideas don't exist till you write them down. I know I've had ideas I thought were cool, and when I try writing them, they're so lame, right? I sit there having drinks with friends, right? We come up with a really cool idea. The next day I think about it, or if you try writing it, it just gets really weak. Wrecker, you and I just were writing this special issue introduction. We talked about the ideas in the front end of that so many times, and there were ideas forming, but they were really lame. You know, when something came out of it is when we drew the picture. Remember, we drew the picture on the frontiers and whatever. Drawing the picture, and the paper I have with Stefan Seidel, again, when we drew the picture and we had to come up with that artifact, when we make the picture, when we do the writing, that's when we create the idea. What we talk about and what we have in our heads is just passing time and getting the generation going, right?
Yeah, I agree, right? So because this is where the level that I want to bring this down to, because I do think there are some practices, some concrete things that people can do to help them with theorizing. So number one is what you just said, like an idea is just an idea. You have to write it down to see whether it works. I fully agree with this. Like, so you have to put it down on paper. Number one, the reason is that if you can't verbalize it in writing, then it's obviously not really thought through. If you have struggled to put that into words.
But not only that, sometimes when you verbalize it, it's lame.
Exactly. Or you realize when it doesn't work. That's what I mean, right? So exactly. So number one, you got to write it down very early. And I'm trying to push every one of the students to say, like, write it down, write it down, write it down. It doesn't have to be an essay. It could be, it could be just, one sentence to explain that one thing, that one concept. Try to write it down so we can have a look at this. You will find out whether it works. So then the other thing, I agree with you. I doodle a lot. I draw. Try to visualize things, I guess, in sort of boxes, arrows, whatever. It could be all sorts of things. I think that helps too. And I think it's because by doing the visual, you have to think about the semantics of the things that you draw. Like an arrow has to mean something.
You need some precision.
It usually is a way of connecting different elements together. So all of a sudden you're talking about relationships. That could be a proposition.
So I don't think you can think clearly without some sort of codification. And I think Youngjin, when he woke up in the middle of the night and said, this is my idea, and he wrote it, and then you read it and said, that's exactly what I'm thinking. It wasn't until you said, you recognized that you liked what he wrote and it had some parallels, but until it was codified, what you had in your head wasn't codified. So you kind of assigned what was in your head, what you're reading. And then you probably elaborated on it. I
disagree. So the role of writing, and it wasn't like I haven't written that idea before, and it's damn hard. It's really, really hard idea. And the challenge was, like, particularly when you bring, ideas, theoretical ideas from other fields, which, the idea that is so fundamental in many different, that can be applied in so many different ways in a very abstract way, it is so easy to be misunderstood. And you have to be extremely careful about assumptions that you carry over and so on. So it was just hard. And I kind of like, I'm going to come back to it at one point, but I'm not going to push it for now. And then this particular paper just became so vividly clear that it is an opportunity to push this idea forward. And then, working with Jan and the other two co-authors with a, powerful sort of simulation as a tool to push this idea was an opportunity that I didn't want to miss. But on the other hand, so I agree with the writing is important, and visualization absolutely helps. But that's not the only time that you actually theorize. You theorize all the times. Those two are representations, and then there are boundary objects that allow you to communicate your ideas in a most clear way. And when you do, so you and I could talk about the idea. We think we understand, but when we put it in writing, then we realize that we actually do not understand. And it happens even after you complete the paper, right? So, I have written papers with other co-authors, and then we thought that we had completely understood that even some of the key phrases we thought that we understood, but then later we realized that actually we had very different images, right? And I think that is where the boundary object, particularly like a visual boundary objects, play a very important role. And, I hope, this is something that I'm personally very interested in, temporality in theorizing, the role of time and evolution and change in theorizing. The visual representation for that is extremely difficult and very challenging. And, so there's animations and other, ways, but 2D representation is pretty much what we can have. And that creates a lot of challenges. So you have to be extremely creative in expressing those three-dimensional, four-dimensional ideas.
I'll give you my, and these are lame, but I used it. So I have this MISQ paper a few years ago, Youngjin, with you, from my dissertation. If you remember, it's the meta-analysis where we had a whole bunch of enterprise systems we reviewed. We looked at existing literature. And if you remember, we had a 2x2 in the beginning, right? 2x2s are always an easy way to think through theorizing. And I find myself doing it all the time. When you sit down, you have an idea. It's like, what's on the horizontal axis? What's on the vertical axis? Let's make 4 quadrants and think it through. It's kind of like the HBR way of thinking through an idea. But, what do you guys think? Is that lame, or is that, because it works for me? Right,
it works for me too. And I think the reason is that it looks so simple, but if you construct these 2x2s, it can be very difficult. And I think the number one problem is to label the axis. Do you agree? Like labeling the axis, it looks innocuous, but it can be very challenging to separate. Hey, are these actually orthogonals? Because they need to be orthogonals, because otherwise you can't create a 2x2, right? So It makes you think about, all right, is this dimension independent from the other one, or is it not? And then that thing over there has to have some sort of contrast to this other thing down there, because otherwise we don't have boxes, right? So it's a simple way, or a seemingly simple way of forcing your thinking to become more disciplined. In a way, like that's one thing I want to bring up. Isn't that what White meant when he talked about disciplined imagination? We try to come up with creative new ideas, but we do so in a disciplined way. And so the 2x2ing and the visualizing, these are all just way of inserting a little bit of structure into our thinking and the sort of voicing articulation process, because it's sort of...
And it gives us categories to write about. We can write each quadrant separately in a sense, and then the relationships.
For me, the disciplined imagination could be with 2x2. You could have a series of, dimensions, and you can create a combinatorial exercise. So this is what I would do. If I'm sitting down with a doctoral student who's doing this 2x2, I will do whiteboarding. I will start first generating dimensions, and then I'll come up with a bunch of different 2x2s. And then I will see like which one makes most sense, right? So that would be the first step. You could end the paper with that. The second one that I would look at is that, okay, is it a dependent variable or is it independent variable? So let's think about, so now I have generated a bunch of other dimensions. I have a luxury of picking other variables from the one that didn't make it to the 2x2. So I can look at it. The third way would be then I will add a temporal dimension. So that could be a completely different paper. So now I have 4 different types Now I'd like to think about whether they will stay the same, each members of the category, or will they move around? And now that allows you to think about a process view. And
if
then
it moves around the
next
categories
step,
of the framework.
yeah, exactly. And then the next review is then what drives that movement. So then you get into the generative mechanism kind of, the paper that is,
what's the
my favorite
explanation?
kind.
Yeah, what's the explanation?
So
Let me jump back to something you said though that I think is really important. It's what's the dependent variable. Even if you're not writing, I think that's one thing, and I see this a lot with junior people. They'll say something like, how do we explain success, or how do we explain some outcome? And then they'll come up with a laundry list of things that would explain the outcome. Well, this explains it, this explains it, this explains it. And then they give a list of all the things. That's not theorizing, right? Or it's very entry level theorizing in the sense that all of these things probably, if you're coming up with a list of things that influence your dependent variable, chances are 80% of them, 90% of them, if not all, have already been said, right? So you should go find the literature. It says that the key is to make an argument about something different, right? That influences that dependent, or what is it that turns it into a theoretical contribution? It's not the laundry list, right?
Yeah. So the laundry list is what the empiricists would do. Like, I want to study everything that influences success. So I'm creating a list of all the things I need to measure to see if they have any relationship with it. So I don't need a theory for that. I just need my laundry list, and then I can measure all that, and I figure out whether that has anything to do with success, right? So the theorizing kicks in when what Youngjin mentioned as the mechanism. The theorizing is about the logic that explains why these things would have
maybe. So let me give you an example that I give my students with this. And when we talk about theorizing, I used sales performance. If you're making a theory about salesmen and sales performance, well, what are the things that are going to drive sales performance? Well, previous sales performance, right? Experience, personality, right? There are all these things that are going to knowledge. All these things are going to drive sales performance. If I list all of them, that's not exciting. What a theory is to say something like, say, and I put this out there that physical appearance drives sales performance, right? I'm actually making an assertion of belief. I'm not denying that all these other things matter. I need to control for them. I need to control for experience, control for previous, right? And I want to say that good-looking people, essentially, and that's my theory, that I think good-looking people are better salespeople. I'm making an assertion of belief. I'm not generating a laundry list. And then I could test it, right? Then I could think of mechanisms. Maybe good-looking people don't directly do it. Maybe good-looking people are more confident, and it's the confidence that drives sales. I can come up with all these things, but coming up with the assertion around the statement of belief, which is good-looking people, all other things equal, will sell more than not so good-looking people, is a testable proposition. That would be a theoretical assertion. Whereas merely listing all of the things that drive good sales performance
would not. It's funny because for me, the theorizing kicks in when you tell me why the good-looking people perform more. And you mentioned some of them. It might be something about building easier social relationships. It might be about confidence. Might be that they get better grades in high school from their teacher because they look better, and therefore they get better entry study programs. Blah blah blah. So this is the logic that is at work. The sort of the gears under the surface that it would produce that outcome. See, that's where I think the interesting bit about the theorizing is not in the assertion. The assertion, yeah, I can go out and test it.
The assertion is the theory. The theorizing to you is the fascinating part, is what you're telling us, the thing that you love, right?
Yeah, the identification, like the figuring out what that logic is, and whether I can do so, by my own thinking, whether I can establish that empirically, I suppose. I can measure a level of confidence. I can have a look at their high school grades, blah, 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 and figure out what the mechanisms are that are at work to with assertion. But I think that's the interesting part. The assertion is just a starting point to me. You know what I mean?
Or the end point.
Yeah.
To me, it's interesting because I think the laundry list is just another way of doing theorizing. Not necessarily interesting, not necessarily exciting, not necessarily something that I would do. But that's fine. You could just keep making the laundry list longer. That's one strategy one can have. Not every paper needs to have elegant, thought-provoking, new framing of the problem.
But like TAM, we know what drives acceptance, right? We know it's perceived usefulness, ease of use in some form or another. Once that's been written, a couple of different times, and we've established it. There's no more, you can come up, there are other variables that you might bring in or something like that, but just simply saying that again and again, and most laundry lists have already been said, right? So
Yeah,
that's
but
the
that's
issue.
not
with the laundry
everybody
list.
needs to write, earth-shaking, groundbreaking theoretical papers. People need to have their jobs and tenures, and they need to keep their career. So, and not everyone's brain is wired to think theoretically in a particular way. So, I think we need a diversity in the scientific community. If you look at physics, they have people who work on instruments, people who do only experiment, people who only do theoretical physics, and these different communities of people come together time to time, and then creating breakthrough innovation. So I think this is perfectly fine. I just don't do that myself, and I don't want my students to do it because I am not good at it. I get easily bored. But if other people are doing it and doing good job and getting it published, I don't have a complaint about it, But the other thing that I would also say that to me is the most exciting part is when I am able to bring that a different perspective. So, like what, the Jan said, that's not the exciting part. The one that, explains the explanation of how it works. That part, I think the detail is exciting, but also when you come up with a completely different perspective that no one has talked about, I think that is actually when things are really exciting. And then let's take that idea all the way through. So what I often say, and then this is where, like when I was working on sort of biological ideas, so oftentimes theoretical insight begins nothing more than a metaphorical idea or image. Because you're reading something totally abstract and music or art or biology or history. And then I wonder whether this may work out here. I think the commitment is then take that idea all the way to its logical conclusion to see where does it take you to. I think a lot of times people stop doing that. People get excited. And so there are two types of people who don't get that sort of thing going, like the imaginative jumping point, or those who only do it, and then come up with half-baked idea and then never take it to all the way, right? And so going
that's what
back
I always
to this
do.
idea,
I'm always doing half-baked ideas.
The paper that Jan and I were talking about, I had that sort of like initial idea, but this paper allows us to have a discipline to take it all the way too. So I think those are important aspects.
I mean, we talked about this. We touch upon this every now and then in this podcast. I mean, I agree with you. We gotta have room in our communities for all these different facets, for all these different roles. So for the person that is just the abstract theorist, right? So the Sheldon Cooper of ICE research.
Well, actually, of those theoretical physicists, aren't they the most high status physicists? Like, well, let's
forget about the hierarchy for a second. Maybe that's right, but that's the point I want to make. The point is that the problem that I'm having is that we are in a field that is not putting value on this. So we're not allowing all these roles because they're not all placed equal. So because some of these things, as you said, are harder to do than others. And in the moment, you could argue that the empiricist, the guy that's really good with experiments and can churn out a bunch of them, he has an easier game because he can churn out more papers than the theorist that thinks about an idea for 5 years. He's really disincentive to do that, and that's a problem because over time that'll literally put these people aside, right? So we don't have a systemic environment in which all of them can really flourish equally. So there's your hierarchy, right? So that's a problem.
It's a reverse hierarchy. The folks who get the machine going. Actually, and I don't know if that's true. I think the world recognizes people like Youngjin, who are these idea generators that really move, make substantive contributions. Youngjin, I think some of your papers are probably not getting like the experiment, whatever I don't even know the name of it. The experiential one in 2010. In 2010, that was your big year, right? You wrote 2 papers. Now the one with Kale and Ola gets a lot of traction. And really that ushered in the era of digital innovation. Then you have your, and that's just a really impactful paper. People know it, they know it exists, and it created the other one, the experiential paper, I don't think people have found yet or something. But if they would pay attention to that paper, they would realize that in the same year, you created essentially the next generation of, I would argue, IS research, right? So that was your big year. After that, it was all downhill. But in 2010, you reached your peak of your career, right? And they were both conceptual papers, and they redefined, I think, research, going forward. Now, yeah, we recognize you. Anyone I talk to in the world respects you. They may be annoyed with you for various reasons, but they respect you, and they know you're a brilliant person, right? And you're a conceptual person. Now, you might not publish the volume, although you publish a pretty breathtaking volume, but there are others who publish the volume that is maybe more than yours. But I think you have a place in the field as a conceptual person.
That's nice, because it's sort of kind,
but
yeah.
I don't know. I mean, we always worry about our place in the world, right? We have this. We emailed Jan the other day. We are all suffering from imposter syndrome, and I feel like I'm a fake all the times, right? So
you feel like you're a fake? Really? You're saying that? This is one of those bullshit, humble things that academics do. They pretend they're imposters.
No.
Kind of like they pretend they don't want to do administrative roles because that's.
Nick, think about my career, right? I was trained in a traditional positivistic tradition at University of Maryland. And then I was hired at Case, and I was surrounded by these guys, like Dick Bull and Kalle Luutinen. And we were having, first couple of years, I was just doing my own thing. And then we started working on this, really, my second PhD project, right? In a way, I was paid better, but, this Frank Gehry project, which lasted almost a decade, and with a slew of doctoral students coming in and out. And we were having weekly meeting. And like how I felt, I mean, literally every week, the meeting, we began with database, we end with Kant, and then, Aristotle in the same meeting room, and we filled with whiteboard. And every day I come home feeling inadequate. Every day I was thinking that these senior guys will figure me out, and I have nothing to contribute. And so I'm not making this up. And then that sort of feeling that, one day that you will be figured out, that people will find out you absolutely have no depth, and no idea of your own, I think is a constant.
So I was in those same meetings with you as a PhD student, if you recall, right? And I'll tell you what my impressions were. I was in the same context, same everything. I'm like, wow, these people get paid for this? This is ridiculous, right? They're just sitting around reading books, talking, thinking, talking to people. This is a racket, right? I mean, I had no imposter syndrome, no nothing. I'm just like, how do people get away with this? Right? They're getting paid.
That's the top secret of our business, right?
So I'm like, I got to learn how to do this, right? I had no delusions that I was capable at any point, but I'm just like, I can figure this out. I could do this thing. This looks fun.
Youngjin, I think it is very good of you actually to speak out about imposter syndrome. I do also think that's a real thing. I also think at the moment, just my own experience, I think that sort of impacts people more in the pandemic because we're so isolated and we don't get to Youngjin, our ideas and so forth, right? So
Youngjin explained his imposter syndrome. I don't buy yours for even a minute.
No, I have the same thing.
I think you're way too arrogant.
But I think my arrogance, which exists arguably, is my way of shielding myself from that. But it is fragile, and it's very fragile at the moment. And with people that I feel comfortable with, then I speak out about it. And you both had that. So I was talking to Youngjin and our co-author, and I said, I'm saying like I'm really not confident whether this is a good idea or whether any of what I'm doing makes sense. In fact, I was referring to the podcast and how insecure I feel about doing this. So that's one example. The other one was with you, Nick, just last week. Was it last week when we talked about our editorial? And I actually asked all of you guys and said, like, are you sure this is even good? I'm not so sure. I lay awake last night and asking whether, oh my God, whether we can put our name on it, whether we can put it out there. That's clear imposter syndrome. The next morning I woke up and I read it again. It's like, hey, this is solid, this is consistent, this is coherent, this is interesting. So, poof, the imposter syndrome was gone, but it does occur. And I think at the moment it's, it's because I'm in this room all the time. But I don't, imposter syndrome is a topic I think we need to explore separately.
So here's I
have two more questions I want to discuss.
Right, I want to discuss imposter syndrome. It's a fascinating topic to me.
It is,
but
right.
We'll move on. I know you want to move on.
No, I want to make this a dedicated, so we talk about it for an hour or so.
All right. In the future, we'll talk about imposter.
I want to, challenge two things that I see occurring. So number one, I think over recent years, and every now and then this happens, people build process models for theorizing. So I mentioned Discipline and Imagination by White. There's a few of these papers, and recent years also in IS, we got these models for how to theorize. Suzanne Rivard, she wrote one, Nick Hassan and colleagues, they all come up with these process models for, these are the things you should do, sometimes even in a sequential order. First do this, then do this, then do this, and out comes a theory. And is it like, I think there's value to all of these papers, of course, but this is not how it works. I can't give you a recipe for theorizing. I can't make it as simple as, here's a template, follow these 7 steps, and out comes a theory. Right. And I know we all feel, especially there's an appetite for these types of template papers that tell you, do these 5 things and you're safe. But what's your view on these models or these papers on theories on how to theorize? That's, I guess, my bigger question here.
So I have a perspective on that, So when Ulla and I wrote that paper, which became liminality paper published in Org Science, I think it took about 7 years for us from the beginning to the actual publication. And of course, Ulla did all the empirical work prior to that. So for him, it's like, 10, 12 years of work. And I enjoy talking about how hard it was, right? And it was like a discipline and so forth. And it was true, it was hard work. But on the other hand, we also complain about the lack of, the influence of our own work. Look, we love to try certain types of work that follows the templates. But the reality is that these papers made it easy for junior colleagues to follow. So and it dawned on me, one day, one of my former doctoral students who I recruited to our PhD program came to me and said, Youngjin, I'm going to switch my research and then I'm going to work with someone else. And it really hurt me. And then I asked him why. And he said, because I don't think I can do what you do. And I said, that's not true. Number one, English is not my native, language, and you are an American, you can write it much better, etc., etc. Really trying to convince him. But at the end, I said, this is my failure, and I should stop talking about how difficult it is, and then I should really try to demystify the theorizing process. This is why I think I agreed to come here, because I think it is our job. In fact, I applaud. I may not agree with all the things that these papers have written, but number one, I have no problem of people creating template following, mechanism papers and 3 boxes and arrows and something comes out and feedback loop. That's great, because I think the more people think like that, chances are we will have a better theory papers down the road. The more econometric papers we have and difference and randomized field experiment, one of those papers will be really good. So I think we need to give people a template to theorize.
And that's the idea, right?
Yeah.
Every paper doesn't have to be wonderful, but we should create conditions under which the great things emerge. Now, this is what I'm hearing you say, though. If you look at your history, you started off doing experiments, right? And you were doing, and I wonder if that's what we should do. It's kind of like a woodworker, right? You want to teach them to use hand tools, sharpen their tools before you move them onto power tools, right? If you're making furniture. Similarly with papers, it's a craft. You don't become Youngjin Yoo in 2010 right away. You got your PhD a decade before your big year, right? And in between there, you had published a couple papers that were from your dissertation and they were doing the experiments, doing the kind of, and I wonder if really that's the advice I would give to a junior, or that you are, I'm backing into the advice is that have them do an experiment first. Pick a well-established literature, do an experiment drawing on that literature, and take the basic steps first. Get that under your belt, then try to be Youngjin Yoo and swing for the fence and go for these big conceptual contributions, right? Would that be advice that we're taking?
No one should be trying to be Youngjin Yoo, because I think it's not very good idea. And my wife will agree with that.
Yeah.
The two, yes, I think experiment is a best way to learn clear scientific logical thinking about all these things. On the other hand, I was very fortunate to be exposed to some of really crazy ideas during the PhD program, not necessarily from my own advisor, but there are very creative people at Maryland. And my first topic of thesis was not an experiment, and it was taken by somebody else. I got very excited about the event study method. Like I learn about event study, and I said, I'm going to do this, IT investment event study. And my advisor says, that sounds like a good idea, Youngjin, do it. And the day that I was going to collect the data, I found an ISR in my mailbox, in my apartment mailbox, and open it. Leading article was that, Dos Santos's IT investment event study, I think it was 94 or something. And I still have that joke with him whenever I see him, like, you ruined my PhD career because I could have done that, right? So I brought that article to my advisor's office. I said, I don't know what I'm going to do. And she said, now at least it was a good idea, do something else. And then second idea I got was like a tested knowledge. So I wanted to do tested knowledge thing. And my advisor said, that sounds great, but you won't be able to finish it. And so you need to do something more reasonable. So I started doing the group decision support and, the role of history. At that time, adaptive structuration theory was a big deal, right? So I was reading it and I wasn't happy with it. So then I went to Giddens through that adaptive structuration theory. So, my experiment was very strange in the sense that it was based on structuration theory. And then I did experiment, right? It was very hard to publish because of that. Some reviewers thought that I was misusing the structuration theory. So,
and you probably were, right?
Yeah, I was probably, yeah, you're right.
But I like that outcome. I really say, I just want to reiterate these 2 points. So number one, Youngjin, this sort of this view on, well, we want to create better conditions for people that follow, that they are more free and have more guidance in any piece of research, in this particular case, theorizing. And if template papers helps them because they draw attention to the idea of metaphors or analogies or whatever, then that's good, right? So, and I like that. It's not necessarily how I looked at these papers, but I like it. And the second thing that Nick said is that, well, there is a benefit in first learning the tools of the trade or some traditional scientific practices, most of which are sort of empirical, like, and so, for example, you could start with experiments, and then over time, maybe you move into a different one. And that made me think that that's probably a little bit of what I did. So I come from a tradition where we didn't start with experiments. In fact, in that school, there was no one that was good at experiments, but we had, case study guys, right? So we all started, every PhD student started with case studies of sorts, right? So we learned that trade, and we moved to, in my case, moved to servers. And then I really wanted to do experiments.
So could I just jump in real quick with case studies? If you think of it, if you go read Yin and you read it with this conversation in mind, Yin's famous book on the case study method, he compares case studies to experiments. And he uses an experimental logic to think of a case study as an experiment, right? And that's his argument for why a single case study is actually valuable. It's just like doing a single experiment, and there are certain conditions that you set it up. Anyway, so I think doing case studies is also another entry into scientific discourse, particularly if you think of it using this experimental logic. Anyway, go on.
So what I said earlier about I had this phase where many years I worked really close with companies, really collaborative in the field, and then I really wanted to do something different. And I guess at some level, I wanted to see whether I can do it, I suppose, right? And I think that's a nice move as well. Of course, if you have the privilege and the security to do so. So in my case, I was professor already tenured, and then of course you can the freedom. And then because I think it's something that I wanted to see whether I as a person can do it. So that goes back to this identity discussion that Nick and I had in the last episode. So I think that's another nice way to look at this. If you do one thing, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to do this forever, but it's probably wise to think about where you start, and then and leave some other parts of the game, so to speak, for a different stage, for a later stage.
It's a marathon, not a sprint. So this is how I'd like to sum up our conversation. The first part is theorizing. Good ways of doing it, playing with it, is 2x2s, other images, and then just get to writing quickly so you know what you're doing. And before aspiring to doing grand theorizing, because you see it, and maybe earlier in your career, pick a more finite or focused approach, like experiments, like case studies. Understand that trade really well and build some experience there, and then step up to becoming a grand theorizer like Youngjin. Do you guys agree with those takeaways?
I'd like to add a couple points to that. One, while I really agree with the idea of this, like a solid craft of understanding the trade of science, but I think you also need to really immerse yourself. There are a lot of doctoral students and junior colleagues who really do not know the practice in organizations, in like IT practices. And I think more dangerous one. So I'm fine with the laundry list variables, but I'm not very happy with laundry list theorizing of totally irrelevant made up problems. So if you at least choose a problem that is relevant, so people look at it and say, yeah, that is a problem, that is important, and so for them, laundry list theorizing actually is quite valuable, right? So that's one thing. So I think we need to create an opportunity for us to know something real, right? If you're interested in cloud computing, do some really immersive experience of cloud computing, for example, and I think that's very important. The other one is that on the other hand, there is tested knowledge aspect that we are not, you are picking that up from your advisors, and PhD program is about that. But I think there's also an opportunity, there's in the music field, for example, there is this kind of like a master class. So they really try to teach the tested knowledge, right, in front of the audience, and then students are picked up, and then they need to perform, and the teacher is demonstrating how you do it, and so on. So I always wonder, whether there is any way that in our field, the craft of writing and craft of visualizing and theorizing, and it's more than a theory development workshop, right? I think there is some value of really doing something like that in a creative way.
But by the way, I should probably pitch this. There's an MISQ author development workshop, right? So people should go to the MISQ page, right. And that's probably very useful for thinking about these things. But a workshop alone isn't going to do the trick, is what you're saying, right?
You're right.
I like this idea. Yeah, like we can talk about this more and more. I'm just picturing some people listening to this and saying, well, you haven't told me anything what I should be doing tomorrow. In terms of, okay, I'm here, I'm thinking about my problem, and I can't come up with my theoretical model. That's just how people look at this. And so like, I want to come up with my theoretical model, and now you guys talk for an hour and I still don't know what I should be doing.
Well, my answer: do reading before you do writing, right? Before you know what your belief is, right? If you take my view that a theory is a statement of belief, maybe learn what other intelligent people have said about it first, and then form your belief. So I always think reading is the best way. And then what happens with me is, as I read, I see, so for example, again, I'll bring up the paper Youngjin Yoo and I wrote based on my dissertation, right? I see that they're in the final paper maybe wasn't there, but throughout the theorizing process, I noticed that these people focus on enterprise systems. They're either focusing on kind of interpretation and social practices locally, or they're talking about power, right? It seems like one or the other. And one of the goals of that paper was try to bring the two together, interpretation and power. right? Because of course they're both there. So it came from reading. So for me, and then I'm thinking, wait, here's a connection they haven't made yet. Let's make it. Here's an idea they didn't think of. Here's my opinion in this particular situation, but it starts with reading. So this is always my advice. The best way to do anything is to read first. You can't contribute to a conversation you're not listening to, you know. We've talked about that week after week, Wrecker, right?
We do. All right, Youngjin, the last time we had Brian and Will on the show, we asked them about career advice for junior scholars, because that gave us a leeway for the next episode to criticize everything they said. So I want to offer the same, give you the same opportunity. If you want to say something that we can then later dissect in the next episode.
Yeah, we can criticize with you.
To junior scholars? You just gave one basically. You said, go out into the world, find a real problem in your domain, and immerse yourself into this before you start doing something. Make sure that the problem is worth looking into. That's how I read what you just said.
Right. Well, I tweeted last night in response to you guys were tweeting about, and I said the three things I always tell my doctoral students, do what you like first.
That's just awful advice. And that's do what you like is silly. Anybody who studies these things, you don't start there, Youngjin.
No, I think it's a good place to be in. Because, like you said yourself, the theory is your belief. My hypothesis is that my belief on that, my theory on that theorizing is that everybody has a starting point. Everybody has some kind of belief, and you can express it as like what you like. So you could try to theorize. So for example, some people, I cannot study at an individual level based on psychological theory. That's my preference. So I will never do it. And I walked away from projects that people have studied, and Youngjin, would you please join me? Even when I was a doctoral student, I told faculty members, I'm not gonna do it because I don't like them. So don't put yourself in a position to do something that you really don't like, and if you don't like.
All right, so I'm going to explain to you what my problem is with the advice, do what you like, right? Because that can be interpreted a number of different ways. What you're actually saying is don't do what you don't like, is what I'm hearing, which is fine. If you tell a young person who has no experience, say, in research to do what you like, if I tell my kids do what you like, they're going to study whatever, the Kardashians, or I don't know what, music, right? The stuff that teenagers, the trick is don't do what you like. It's to, I agree with you, find out what you don't like and make sure you don't do that. Absolutely. So I agree with you there, but do hard things. And we've talked about this in the podcast before. There's work on this, but it's challenge yourself. And then when you find a challenge that you didn't know you liked, the like follows the ability.
You didn't let me finish the other two. So second advice is that realize this world is a hard place to live. You don't get to do only what you like. So learn like what you do. So as a doctoral student, I had to do shitty projects, like sometimes because my advisor asked me to do, sometimes my faculty or the research assistantship. So, try to like it, find something that you enjoy. That's second opinion, advice. The third advice, no matter what you do well. If you don't do well, doesn't matter. Really doesn't matter. So, and then I talked to a lot of people who try to do conceptual work, theoretical work, qualitative work. The first thing I hear from them is that journals are not fair because top journals don't like my kind of work.
Fair. Well, they're not fair. They're arbitrary.
Yeah, exactly. It's hard, but you have to push yourself to be understood. Yeah. The fact that the journals are not publishing your work is that reviewers don't understand what you're trying to say. And so it is our job to communicate what, awesome idea that we have. Yeah. And if they fail to understand, chances are it is my job. I didn't do what I need to do. So that's my.
So I'm going to agree with your advice, but I'm going to reformulate it. Your first one is don't do what you don't like. The second one and the third I'll go with exactly as you presented it. And then you get my buy-in. Then I will approve.
All right. That's the only important thing, getting Nick's buy-in. That's my goal. Yeah.
Good.
That's why I'm doing all of this, of course. That and the immense monetary gains I'm getting from all my contracts.
The wealth.
the wealth that is accruing in my personal bank account
faith,
from all the
yeah.
sponsorship from
You're actually paying for
Nike.
everything.
Yeah,
I'm gonna have to buy you like a
bit.
bottle of scotch when I see you, because you are paying for literally everything with this. So yeah.
That's right. All right, Youngjin, was a pleasure having you. This is probably the longest episode we've done so far, but I could have gone on forever, and
Me too.
that was really
Sorry
nice.
for
Thanks for taking
speaking
the
too
time.
much.
No,
No, it was fun.
all right.
Yeah.
All right,
Yeah, you'll be
thanks, guys.
forgiven, Youngjin.
Yeah, thank you for having me.